Good evening, hello, and welcome to Parallax Lecture Series. This is our 13th lecture. Parallax is an online European media platform offering constructive and fresh perspectives for the post-postmodern age. We publish essays and podcasts, webinars and lectures, and are a hub for original and heterodox thinking. The word parallax stems from the Old Greek parallaxis, which means to shift the viewpoint of the observer. The name suggests psychoactive and alternative sense-making, as opposed to mainstream narratives and ideologies. Through our work with various European digital tribes, we create media and Bildung, which means education, and promote social, cognitive, and spiritual development. Moreover, we aim to provide a European counterpoint to the dominant Anglo-Saxon narrative. That's our new spiel. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm here with Cadell Last, co-author of Sex, Masculinity and God, a wonderful trialogue with a couple of his friends. And in the first series, we talked about God, and today we're going to talk about masculinity. So Cadell is going to speak for a few minutes, about 45 minutes or so. Is that right, Cadell? But you got about 45 minutes or an hour prepared or something like that?
Yeah.
And then we're going to open it up for dialogue, for engaged dialogue. So we hope you will join in and discuss these questions with us. And hopefully that will be lots of fun. If you are enjoying these Parallax lecture series, we're working on a Patreon site. We're working on a membership system, but we appreciate any kind of help or you can give us, or you know, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our newsletter, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, Cadell, do you want to tell us about this very taboo topic, something that we're really not allowed to talk about, which is why we want to talk about it on Parallax. Masculinity. What is masculinity? What the hell is masculinity? And Cadell's going to take us on a little journey about masculinity. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks for the opening. Just for the continuity of the video series, the first video series we talked about sex. This one's masculinity, and then next month will be God. So I'm gonna share my screen and give it just go straight into it. Let me see. All right. So if you can see my screen there, I co-authored a book with Kevin Oros and Daniel Dick titled Sex, Masculinity and God. And you can visit the website, sexmasculinityandgod.com, if you're interested in ordering it and diving deeper into the trialogues we held. Basically, for me, I was motivated to write this book because I was at an interdisciplinary institute and I felt like the topics of sex, masculinity, and God were kind of taboo and kind of we couldn't have full open discussions about the meaning of these concepts. And at the same time, they were extremely important to things I was going through in my life. So I met these two fellows and we decided, let's dive deep into these topics and let's try to understand the meaning of these topics for the present moment. So, like Andrew said, 3 taboos. I think that for the first topic, I centered on the idea that our knowledge was desexualized. The first topic was we discussed sexuality and just the idea that the knowledge, our abstract intellects, are oftentimes disconnected from our sexual body, and that has huge consequences for society, and that has huge consequences for how we organize. In this topic, I want to, focusing on masculinity, I also want to sort of situate that within our current era, which is kind of a feminist era. And there have been various waves of feminism, which I think constitute, at least in some aspects of these waves, an anti-masculine, ethos and an anti-masculine metaphysics. So in some sense, my engagement with masculinity is in that context. It's in the context of the reaction to existing in a feminist or femme-centric world, and the effects that that has on men and notions of masculinity. So in order to start, I want to sort of fully include myself in this presentation. By fully including myself in the presentation, I mean I'm going to open up about how I, as a subject, have related to both the masculine principle and the feminine principle in my life. And to emphasize this, I want to say that sexuality is not just about the mind or the body, but really about the way the mind and the body struggle with lack and excess, what Lacan called the object petit a. And that sexuality is something which is situated in the sort of existential or phenomenal experience of lack and excess. So around this lack and excess, dream symbols appear, at least in the Freudian hypothesis. Symbols like king and queen represent notions like father and mother. And both of these dualistic symbolisms are kind of modalities or symbolic expressions of lack. So that's sort of the theory I'm going to be using to sort of share with you my own particular relationship with the masculine and the feminine. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the father, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the mother, and in the center, you'll see a heart with a little A, which represents the lack and the excess. So on the left-hand side, I mean, I grew up with a very dysfunctional relationship with my father, and I could not map my self-image, or I could not map my notion of self onto the father, because I had a very negative relationship with him. I had a very, I had an experience of him as violent, and I had an experience of him of extreme fear. So I found myself in some sense in a constant self-mapping to other older men who I somehow could map my identity onto. And I've run into a lot of neuroses over my development due to failures of this self-mapping process. So in other words, basically failures of idealization, or failures of the ability to sort of both align my identity with older men that I respect and sort of build a developmental and intergenerational, healthy developmental and intergenerational dialogue with these figures. And a lot of neuroses result as a consequence of this failure. And then I moved into a space of basically criticizing and pointing out the lack in older male figures. So due to sort of failures of self-mapping, at least for me, I entered into a very critical, very even deconstructive mode of identity, where you're mostly focused on pointing out the lack in the male figures as opposed to self-mapping onto them. So where I find myself now is basically trying to bring my consciousness to a sense of positive mapping in lack itself, without sort of relying too much on idealizations of older men. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see sort of representations of the mother. I had a sort of classical strong attachment to the mother. As this process unfolded and the attachment shifted from the mother, it ended up becoming replaced with substitutions of other quote-unquote queen figures. And a similar forms of neuroses emerged from failures to map onto queen figures. And then from this failure of the substitution, basically the lacking object, I entered into a state of sort of wandering excess, which coincided with the critical lack on the father side, where you no longer believe in queen figures or no longer believe in substitutions for the mother, and find yourself in a sort of disoriented multiplicity or apathic multiplicity. And now, how to deal with that process is just something I'm going through. But I wanted to give this introduction because I wanted to include myself as a subject into this whole process. And I wanted to demonstrate the utility in thinking about sexual difference from the point of view of problems with lack and also problems with excess. But that's maybe too much of a digression. So let me go into the contents of masculinity itself. And this presentation will be in some sense inspired by the narrative of the conversation in the book Sex, Masculinity and God. So in the book Sex, Masculinity and God, we start with the sexual real, and the sexual real is neither masculine or feminine, but it's rather the negative space between the two. And we've had a lot of reflections recently about one of the problems in our culture is that we no longer love sexual difference. We find sexual difference to be problematic for some reason, instead of seeing sexual difference as something to enjoy, something to work with, something that's natural and normal. So we start off with the sexual real by identifying that polarity, the difference, that the negative space charges a difference in polarity between the two. This is necessary for attraction, motion, and social position. And so it makes sense that if this polarity is disrupted, you would have huge confusion when it comes to attraction. You have huge confusion when it comes to our motion as bodies. And you'll have huge confusion about social positioning. Where do I position myself in the social body as a whole? Because of a failure of a sort of an ability to deal with this real. To make a further distinction, I think it's worthwhile to understand the difference between the registers of the real and the registers of the imaginary. So the real is kind of this asymmetry between the two, again, this negative space. And the job of engaging with the real, with your symbolism, with your words, is kind of trying to manage constitutive imbalance and disharmony. Whereas the level of the image, and I think where usually people are aligning their symbolism, is on the level of symmetry. So they presuppose or idealize some perfect balance or harmony, which would cover up the real and resolve the sexual deadlock and the polarity. So I suppose what I'm saying is that in order to engage with the sexual real, you have to, as much as possible, bring your symbolism to kind of the pragmatic management of the imbalance and the disharmony, and try as much as possible not to cover up problems in the real with images of a perfect symmetry or a balance and a harmony. That being said, in the context of our current historical epoch, the man's ability to navigate the sexual real has itself been significantly disrupted, specifically because in our era, I think the philosophy and the metaphysics of our era is dominated by a type of deconstructive mode of patriarchy, basically deconstructing the patriarchy. And you might say that this has been happening, that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, but it really intensifies after World War II in the form of extreme negativity and extreme criticism directed at the quote unquote darker aspects of the masculine. And the consequences for the larger philosophical and metaphysical culture is that there's a popular mythos that tends to be anti-logos, anti-maps, and anti-narrative. Because we get our maps, we get our narrative, and we get our words basically from the masculine pole. We get that from the masculine side of the sexuation process. So in my view, any philosophy that is anti-logos, anti-maps, and anti-narrative fundamentally, not just critiquing a certain modality of logos or a certain modality of mapping or a certain modality of narrative, is in some sense an anti-masculine philosophy. And it's a philosophy which is probably privileging the feminine pole, which would be more on the side of image, which would be more on the side of the power of the image itself, which kind of transcends or does not need expression in narrative form. And we can go into, maybe in the Q&A, the deeper meaning of this transition. Of course, in popular philosophy or in the dominant philosophers of this era, figures like Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault are figures that ultimately introduce tools which are, deconstructive in their nature and seek to sow doubt and seek to sow, in some sense, fundamental critique of even the attempt to organize the world with logos. Famously, Jacques Derrida's philosophy, he claims that our civilization is phallogocentric, which means the phallus, the logos, and that we put rational dialogue and, the structuring of the world with logos at the center of our culture. And he sought to sort of, usurp this modality of metaphysics. And of course, there's good reason to do this, but I think that it went too far in some sense. So at the same time, it's kind of what opens up the possibility for new feminist waves of activity. And also a paradox of feminization, or the feminist movement, I should say. Which is that feminism as such is kind of a strange form of masculinization, which is to say that the new feminist waves that appear in this deconstructed patriarchy era are waves of feminism which seek to position female bodies on the masculine side of sexuation and position feminine bodies as basically more masculine subjects. So the way I'm saying it here in this presentation is basically the female body finds itself in masculine social positioning, and the male body, for the most part, finds itself in confusion and disorientation, because on the one hand, you're told that the masculine positioning is somehow wrong, and on the other hand, you're sort of wanting to sort of rectify historical injustices of, or perceived historical injustices against women and let female bodies occupy any social position that they can or want. So this really puts, I think, a lot of men in a very strange psychological position. And for most men I talk to, they're not even aware that this metaphysical scaffolding kind of structures and positions their bodies, or that it is kind of responsible for a lot of their confusion and disorientation. And it's hard to tell men about this, essentially, because they, for the most part, are good guys who don't want to be anti-feminine, or good guys that don't want to be against women. They want to have a symbiotic, healthy relationship with women. And they don't realize, sort of the larger metaphysical scaffolding within which their ideas about masculinity have already been conditioned in this a priori negative way. It's really a problem. At the same time, of course, online, there are a lot of men who are aware of this, and they have built entire communities to talk about it, to discuss it, to express themselves in various manifestations. I think the main signifiers of this culture are red pill or manosphere. And of course, they're usually outside of institutions. Of course, they're not supported by institutions. And they're mostly organizing themselves in virtual communities where they can sort of speak without censorship and organize a new vision of what they want masculinity to be after these waves of feminization. So the main sort of signifier to me that defines the red pill and the manosphere is a conscious recognition of female deference culture. That is to say that men are trained to defer to femme-centric idealizations and not really go deeply into what it means to be a man, to develop purpose, vision, and a life filtered through their own desires and their own understanding of what it means to be in a male body. what I've seen a lot of is a lot of men who basically castrate themselves in the psychoanalytic sense of the term, not literally, but that they feel a lot of guilt and shame about masculine nature. They have a lot of unconscious presuppositions about what it means to be a man that is inherently negative, and that the consequence of this is that there's a lot of depression and a lot of, again, I'd say disorientation, which can't articulate itself in a way that allows for the resolution of symptoms that appear in this sort of metaphysical scaffolding. Many of the solutions that come out of the red pill manosphere are controversial, but I think the main dominant streams and solutions that come out are actually quite helpful. I think that most men sort of have come to the conclusion that feminine reality or subjectivity in a feminine body, which sort of accepts the position of being in the feminine body, kind of finds purpose, meaning, and life orientation more naturally, simply by the fact that they have bodies which can give birth to offspring. So they're ordered, their reality in some sense is ordered by the creation of a child, and that their main orientation and their main aim in life is to kind of mediate the process of becoming mothers and having children. And even though a lot of this is happening unconsciously, and for a lot of women, a lot of this is being delayed, not in teens or 20s, but into the 30s. And a lot of, I think, red pill manosphere believe that a lot of the disruption and confusion is primarily at the site of this sort of developmental delay in both women coming to terms with their own body and the desire to sort of occupy masculine social positions and at the same time have a child. And that this is entirely disruptive. So the sooner we can talk about this openly and the sooner we can talk about this honestly, the sooner we can get to a deeper understanding of the relationship between the masculine and feminine, which could again maybe reinstate some sort of real, which is different than the real that existed before the movements of feminism, but nonetheless a real that allows for sense making as it relates to sexual difference. Whereas masculine reality is kind of, it has a different obstacle than feminine reality, because the image of the masculine is kind of related to creation out of nothing but themselves, because men can't have babies. Women create out of nothing through intercourse and the vagina, and then having a child, and then they're neurologically bound to that child, and then the image of themselves is transferred from their own sort of attraction to the child, and that's where their affection and attention goes. But the masculine reality kind of has to deal with being in the void itself, and having to, you could say, create something out of nothing, not with their own bodies, but with their minds, and their words and their ability to organize with other men. So I think that the best aspect of the red pill and the best aspect of the manosphere is both the recognition of a need and also a call for positive brotherhood, that basically can confront purpose in the void and also cultivate our inherent potentials towards higher levels of actualization, towards higher levels of community, towards higher levels of service to others, and in a way that would take care of both women and children. So how this would manifest, obviously this has not manifested yet, even though there are positive signs that it is emerging. I think it's the logical consequence of men being willing to accept that there's a problem and being willing to go deeply into that problem on many different emotional levels and aligning their collective struggle, because in the aligning of the collective struggle, you can have the possibility for brotherhoods where, they're not falling into toxic brotherhoods. There are various manifestations of that. But positive brotherhoods, which can, again, confront the void itself and cultivate new potential for a new world. And that, in some sense, brings us to questions of religion and theology, which is very interesting, especially for a generation of men, at least in my generation, that grew up in a very atheistic, a very secular culture. And also, in retrospect, it's kind of interesting that the emergence of deconstruction and the emergence of the deconstruction of the patriarchy also coincided with a deconstruction of religion, and specifically the Christian world. So if any religion has undergone deconstruction, I would say it's Christianity more than any other religion. It has had to weather more critique and more skepticism and more negation than I think any other modern religion, because the people who, the cultures that were Christian or predominantly Christian have kind of left it. They've withdrawn from it, or they've abandoned it, or they've transitioned from it. And I think in the void of Christianity, the main forms of spiritual expression you find are more pagan spiritual expressions, which seek to sort of institute a metaphysics of multiplicity, of sort of I would even say a sophistic culture, where sort of individual opinion is privileged over truth in the Platonic sense, or even the Christian sense. And that, of course, even the reason why I'm giving this talk, or even the reason why I wrote Sex, Masculinity and God, is in some sense my own affirmation that this pagan form of spirituality is not capable. You can't run a contemporary civilization on this software, so to speak, that there needs to be the emergence of a new type of, potentially religion or theology, or a new metaphysics of how we deal with, the deconstruction of the Christian world, which was in some sense the phallus of the West, in a deep sort of primal patriarchal sense. At the same time, along with pagan spirituality, there is kind of the rise of what you could call a replacement phallus for the Christian world, which would be the type of scientism, the atheist secular culture, and that was very popular in the 90s and the 2000s especially. But again, you see so many tensions and problems with the atheist secular scientist culture, because it doesn't really allow for the formation of communities, and it doesn't really engage deeply with problems of, I would say, sexuality and death primarily. So I think in order to confront problems of sexuality and death, you might say violence as well, we need to be able to develop real conversations around these topics. And I think from having those conversations, we could formulate a new hypothesis of the phallus. That's basically my personal view. Is one of the reasons why I'm interested in the unconscious and studying the unconscious is really mostly to reformulate a hypothesis on the phallus. So again, I want to re-emphasize here on the next slide of religion and theology that pagan spirituality to me represents a metaphysics of multiplicity, and it highlights and emphasizes inner practice and inner experience, or personal practice and inner experience, I should say. And I'm not against personal practice and inner experience. I think personal practice and inner experience are very valuable. But it doesn't necessarily allow for the formation of social communities in a deep way, and that we need to be able to talk about the problems of forming deep community. And of course, in our historical culture, the monotheistic religion, specifically of Christianity in the West, was the way in which we collectively organized. And it was the logos of our culture. If you went to Sunday Mass every Sunday, you would basically be getting the word. And the word was something to help you organize your practical life affairs, and something to help you deal with the practical realities of social life and the human existential condition. So in that sense, the main difference to me between pagan spirituality and monotheistic religion is, in some sense, the view on quote unquote the word, or the ontological position of the word. In my view, the monotheistic religions have a thesis on the word, which is that it's a positive ontological force that allows for the stabilization of vision and purpose, and that the pagan spiritual traditions have a more negative relationship to language, have a more negative relationship to the word, and they mostly engage in practices of withdrawal from the world, viewing it as impossible. And in some sense, Christianity also views the world as impossible, but nonetheless seeks to cultivate an ethos and a practice of community love, communal love, to nonetheless engage with it. So how would this affect, how would discussing religion and theology really go back to the sexual real and deal with gender polarity? I think that one of the biggest features of the current gender struggles is that both men and women, mostly because they're in a metaphysical scaffolding that they themselves don't understand, it's unconscious, operate in sexual relationship with each other in a zero-sum relation. In other words, they unconsciously presuppose that man and woman cannot engage with each other in a situation where both parties win. They unconsciously presuppose that one party has to win and the other party has to lose. And so there's this sort of hegemonic struggle where either you'll have women actively manipulating and trying to take advantage of men, or you'll have also men on the sort of toxic end of the red pill manosphere world, which are actively trying to exploit and manipulate women. So it goes both ways, and it's in a very violent and it's a very dangerous sexual territory. It's kind of neoliberal sexuality. And I think it operates on the, again, I want to emphasize, I think it operates on the unconscious presupposition of a zero-sum relation between man and woman. So the question I basically ask myself in this current tension is, what is the possibility of positive sum relationships, win-win relationships between man and woman? And I think for me, it would have to start with a mapping, a cognitive mapping project of the bodies that we have to deal with and work with. And if you're not dealing with a sort of, a real mapping project of the very bodies that we have to work with in order to build relationships and sexual tension, then you're going to be lost in illusion and you're going to be lost in fantasy, which is not connected to the real. So I'm not against fantasy, or I'm not against dreams or images for that matter. But if they're not situated in the real, then there's going to be a disconnect between your speech and the real, and that will end up in catastrophe. It'll end up in identity death, basically. One of the ideas we propose in the book is to think about orthogonal complementarity as opposed to oppositional dynamics between man and woman. So, for example, if you say the word strong, you would usually connect that to a masculine principle, and the opposite of strong might be weak. So nobody wants to be weak. So woman would see strength as masculine as a sort of attack on her femininity, sort of presupposing she's weak. But if you're thinking in orthogonal ways, then if you say masculine is strong, you could say feminine is soft, which is not the opposite, but an orthogonal value, which is very positive, where if you have a strong man and a soft woman, and they engage in a positive sum relationship where they presuppose that both parties can win, then I don't see in principle why the negative space between the polarity can't once again be seen as a positive thing. This is the weird nature of what I call, or what Hegel called and what I use, negation of negation. So negation of negation is a recognition of negativity, a full recognition of negativity, but nonetheless, the affirmation that one can still function and one can still live an interesting and even deep life by confronting and accepting this negativity. For the second aspect of the gender polarity, I think that we can see the feminist waves and we can see the postmodern philosophical era defined as it is by deconstruction, defined as it is by challenge to the phallus and challenge to logos and challenge to mapping of such, is that we can sort of take up and include within our current culture what happened there as the possibilities for exploring androgynous transference. It's true that in some sense the feminist waves have been a feminine taking up of the masculine, and less consciously than probably is ideal for healthy relationships. But nonetheless, this process is something that we can see as a positive thing. I think that if the feminine takes up more of the masculine and vice versa, the masculine takes up more of the feminine, you can avoid traps of over-masculinization. That would be over-identification with your words, or over-identification with your map, or over-identification with your particular way of framing linguistic reality. And then on the other hand, you can avoid the traps of over-feminization, which we might be seeing actually a lot in our current culture, where there's this over-emphasis on the image, and the way in which the image dominates, the feminine image in particular, dominates our contemporary online universe. Most of the traffic on the internet is probably being driven by the feminine image. And that does lead us into problems of a culture of too much dependence on the mother, too much dependence on the feminine principle, and a lack of ability for men to assert their own identity and to mature, basically, cognitively mature, and to become men that can lead in the darkness. Like I was saying about the possibilities of men coming together and building new positive brotherhoods that can approach problems and build communities in a way that we've maybe never seen before, hopefully. And then finally, I would be interested in proposing, and this comes up in the book, a type of quadratic categorization scheme which operates in the gap between mind and body. Because I think so much of the confusion of our mapping, so much of the confusion of our ability to deal with gender and gender difference comes in the gap between mind and body, where it is possible to feel masculine in a female body, and it is also possible to feel feminine in a male body. So that's not impossible, and it's totally logical, even though it's on the whole rare, or less common, I should say, than a man who feels masculine in a male body, or a woman who feels feminine in a female body. So on the one hand, I think there's the important distinction of male and man, where male represents the genetic determination and man represents the symbolic social positioning. And female represents the genetic identity of the body, and woman represents the symbolic social positioning. So you can have a male man and a male woman. You can have a female woman and a female man. And to me, this is at least a start to thinking about a geometry of identity, which doesn't erase the negative space, and it doesn't get rid of problems of handling sexual polarity, but it does potentially help us to gain some sort of a deeper understanding, which does transcend the simplistic binary of if you're born in a male body, you're a man, or if you're born in a female body, you're a woman. So I just want to then bring it back to my start by basically saying that sexuality operates in the lack between mind and body. In some sense, the mind, I think, is metaphysically connected to time, and the body is metaphysically connected to earth. And so if you get one of these polarities wrong and you go into a deep form of extremism, you can have a deep metaphysical fracturing of one of these polarities. So if we're living in a feminine age, I would say that the dominant problem of our time is the problem of the mind and time. And that's what I see in sexual relationship. What I see in sexual relationship is basically the problem of time and the problem of the mind's capacity to conceptualize the space. So it's basically a problem of masculinity. So in some sense, what I'm saying is that the metaphysical duty of the masculine is to organize a logos that makes sense for its time, and to basically give body to the earth in some sense, in some I think deep sense. And again, just to include myself in this presentation, I've had, incredible, I'm a symptom of this age. I had a dysfunctional relationship with my father. I had a problem with mapping onto king figures. I am a product of extreme neurosis in failure. I am someone who became very critical of masculine logos and the ability and the problems of tyrannical logos. And I am trying to come to terms with this identity process by, again, trying to engage in a positive mapping project, which is directly engaged with lack itself. At least that's my current position, or that's where I find myself at the moment. So I really wanted to include myself in that regard. Again, the book Sex, Masculinity, and God covers 3 taboos. In the first presentation with Parallax, I wanted to focus on knowledge, and specifically how our knowledge has been desexualized, and that presents many problems for our culture. Primarily problems of social development, personal development, and community. And then in this topic, I wanted to focus on feminism as sort of, the consequences of feminism as an anti-masculine metaphysics, and the way, hopefully also giving a positive view on how we can view this phenomenon, and how to situate it within the development and emergence of a new masculinity. And then in the next presentation, I want to talk about the post-religious era and the metaphysical mysteries that are involved in existing in a post-religious era. So again, the book is Sex, Masculinity, and God. You can visit the website, sexmasculinityandgod.com. And if you're interested in diving deeper, and we also have a Facebook group and email list where you can stay up to date with new projects we're working on. So thank you so much. And that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Cadell. I'm going to invite the participants. There's also a bunch of people watching on YouTube. There's 2 people. I'm going to invite them to become panelists so we can have a conversation. And we'll just see how it goes, hey? Okay. So normally, and we have a Q&A, which is available at YouTube if anybody wants to ask questions on YouTube. So perhaps I'll start it off, Cadell. Your story, had some similarities to mine, and perhaps some differences in encountering this like violent father and then running towards the feminine in some kind of a way. Except that for me, it wasn't the violent father that was bothering me. It was the father lack. And I've been talking to and Alexander, our friend Alexander Bard, said something that, many of the men in the men's movement are actually they're unhappy with their fathers because they wanted their fathers to be more like their mothers, because they didn't know the difference between the mother and the father. And so Alexander was saying, yeah, there's some aspect of fatherhood which is detached, like the father primarily wants to go off and is out there, and we have to accept that the father is a little distant. And I like that idea. I like that provocation. At the same time, it bothers me in the sense that as a father of a 1-year-old, I sort of think that a father has to be also intimate with the child, and so I wondered if you could talk about like male intimacy and what that means.
Yeah, for sure. I do think that it's very natural for a baby and an infant and a young child to be more in line with the mother and require more attention and presence from the mother than the father. But I also think that as the child grows up and as the child matures, I think that it shifts. I think that as the older the child gets, I think the more important the father becomes potentially, or ideally. Mm-hmm. And that transition is in some sense a transition from the safe, nurturing space of the mother's image to the guidance and direction and maturity of the father's logos. And that having an older man who you can look up to as a model of how to be in the world, and having a man who can just stoically be there and hold your emotional problems, is, I think, one of the bravest and one of the most important acts an older man can do for a younger man. Of course, if that's your biological child, that's great. But I think it's also important that men in general realize this. I think it's so important that older men connect with younger men in a way that they're trying to help nurture and bring out the best qualities of their development. And that is at least a form of intimacy to me, which is more important to me in some sense, even than deep, close connection to a woman. When I've connected with, like when I've in some sense idealized an older man as someone who inspires me and someone who I'm looking to for direction, his acceptance of me and his ability to, in some sense, hold my speech, is so life affirming. It's so invigorating. It's so motivating for all of my future projects and all of my notions of self. And it also, in some sense, gives me the ability and the strength to relate to the feminine in a way that's mature, in a way that isn't kind of a recoil to the mother image, in some sense. So yeah, I hope that helps. But I do think that the sort of natural order of things is for the younger child to be in a feminine environment and for that to sort of flip. And I think that because our culture I think our culture struggles so much with developmental thinking. Like that's what I've been saying lately is our culture has struggled so much with developmental thinking and intergenerational thinking. Because I think that's a masculine problem because, again, it's a problem of organizing time, and our developmental trajectories are kind of all in a confused state because our environment is so different than our historical environment. Like in the 15th century, in the 16th century, or whatever century, there wouldn't be that much change in developmental trajectory from one generation to the next.
Yeah, right. So would it be like what age would you move into the more masculine sphere? Would that be like age 2 or would that be at puberty or I guess there's different ways to look at it, right?
I do think puberty might be a good marker to look at.
Yeah.
Like it's certainly that in like, especially for young boys, I suppose, because when you hit puberty for both boys and girls, it's such a disruption in your identity, and the nature of the development is irreversible. And I do think that men are just kind of left with, they're kind of left in the void with this hugely disruptive, energetic charge in their body. So if there are older men that can sort of guide them in an age-appropriate way, I think that would be really healing for the culture. And I know a lot of teenagers and young boys and young men are really struggling with a lot of issues about sexuality that that they don't know how to deal with, issues of addiction to masturbation, issues of addiction to porn, issues of wondering how to deal with female nature, and issues of wondering how to symbolize the relationship between man and woman. So if there was more developmental support, I think that would be good. And at the same time, when I'm saying that, I think that there's problems with it, because the older men didn't grow up in this environment, and in some sense, many of the older men are probably also struggling with issues of a similar nature.
I think boys get a lot of information from their mothers, and they get most of their information from their mothers. And that's the problem, is they don't get the information from the dad, because the dad's not supposed to give them the information. The dad's, at the office or something like that, right? He's not taking them out hunting or.
Yeah, I mean, and even the fact that we are like, I guess this is connected to the thesis of my previous presentation about our knowledge being desexualized, because we live in a very intellectual culture in some sense, but our work is disconnected from our community life, or our work is disconnected from our family life. And men and women are now both, by and large, working. So there's this problem where children are growing up without real deep connection with either fathers or mothers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have lots of questions for you, Cadell. Maybe I could open it up though to other people if they have one. Does anybody else have questions here? Who's here today? No questions, Tom? Well, maybe I could ask you this question about negativity, because you said an interesting thing, and I know you're a Hegelian, and you think a lot about the negativity and negation, and I was thinking that you said at one point that there needs to be a full recognition of negativity, and I thought that was. And that's like this humbling experience. Perhaps a boy experiences that in a rites of passage, or
exactly.
That's very profound, I think. And I also think that what in religious traditions, when you get married and you have this third principle, you're getting married with a God, right? You're getting married under God. Yeah. You could call that a negativity as well. You could also call it a positivity. I mean, you could call it like, okay.
I would call it a negation of negation. So you could call it.
The problem is maybe that people, like you say, you have the zero sum thing with people, men and women in conflict, the culture war with each other, and they don't have this overarching meaning for why they're together. Like they don't really know why they're together.
Exactly.
And I think that even in my own relationships, it took me some time, to understand why I was with somebody. Like, why the fuck am I with this person? And I kind of realized it was about intimacy at one point, that it wasn't about performance and it wasn't about but that took me a while. And I don't think people, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think that, it's super interesting. I do think that, so the interesting thing of so I agree, marriage is an interesting, I would call it an interesting negation of negation, because the word I always say is that it's interesting that at marriage ceremonies, you'll have "until death do us part." So that would be the aspect of marriage which fully accepts negativity. So you get your limits and you get your constraints from the fact that you're going to die. We're not going to live forever.
And you can't just be with whichever partner you want. You're bound to one person. That's another negativity, isn't it?
You're constraining yourself.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the generation today is having trouble knowing where the constraint is or knowing where the limit is. So they're basically doing a lot of emotional, hysterical provocation of the phallus to sort of test where the limit is. Can I go here? No. Can I go? Why? And the logic. Why can't I go there? Why can't I have as many partners as I like, or just mess around with sexuality? Why can't I? Yeah. What's the logic? It's testing the unconscious.
So, and if you don't have an answer to that question, people just think the entire older generation is, tyrannical and they're full of shit and they don't
Exactly.
Right. So there's no answer to that question. We have to give an answer to that question, right?
Yeah, and
perhaps religion was what used to give an answer to that question. And then now, like, I don't know, is it the therapist who gives answer? But that, who gives the answer to that question?
Well, it's a good question. I think that in the past, it's like the religious scaffolding gave the answer.
Yeah.
But today, what I see is people, and this is, I think, people spontaneously testing their own unconscious, is people want to discover the logic for themselves. So so it's basically they want to invent the equivalent of a metaphysical scaffolding which religion would give them, but they want to be the people who develop it. So they want to be the creators of the metaphysical scaffolding which gives them limit. Which
is a bit ridiculous.
In a sense, but I mean, in some sense, I see that happening.
How could you be the one to create how could you be the one to create the rules for, what's going on? How could that be you? I mean,
well, there is a way in which it's a symptom of neoliberalism, because we live in an age which is very individualistic, and we live in an age which is very egotistical and narcissistic. So there's a way in which people think they are like sort of the ultimate creators of their reality. But of course, I think a few people, for example, in the intellectual deep web, have made the point that the chances that you will develop a religious scaffolding which is better and more effective than the religious scaffoldings that have existed in the past is very low. And so that it saves you time and energy to at least educate yourself.
Yeah. I mean, why would you want to reinvent mathematics? I mean, in a sense, like.
Well, this is the era of deconstruction.
Yeah.
So like there are a lot of mathematicians, like this is in all fields. Like there are a lot of mathematicians and there are a lot of physicists that are trying to reinvent the entire field and trying to deconstruct everything that came before.
Yeah.
So there is this sense in which we as subjects are trying to locate ourselves as, basically, what are my powers of creation? And because all of the old figures of limit and all of the old figures of authority are no longer trusted. They're no longer seen as valid. Like they don't seem to have a ground to stand on. And there is an element of truth to that. And there is a way in which the environment we exist within now is so radically different than any environment that existed before that it makes sense that we need an open space to experiment with something new. But in my view, my view is we should educate ourselves on the best philosophers, the best religious traditions, the best of the best. We should educate ourselves on them. We shouldn't just strongly identify with them, but we should be aware of them deeply, and we should try to bring them to the table and see and do trial and error experimentation. What works for our current era and what doesn't. But it has to be true to the consciousness of the present moment. If it's not true to the consciousness of the present moment, then I say, yeah, discard of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I have a question. So, Cadell, I don't know. It's not a very formulated thought. I tried to do this because I'm wondering what you might think about this. I tried to express that in the last talk with Michael Butler, I think was his name, Andrew, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, how do I begin? It's about this men's movements and masculinity philosophy, like in general, and I wonder if that's not like a paradox, or if it's not invading of like if the female paradigm is invading masculinity. So what I mean by that is we as men we always we're fighting with our environment, right? And so we always had like to create some form of a solution for us to be alive and to create something new. And in a way, I've read this quote by Peterson that personality basically is a solution, a new solution to a complex problem, right? And so like I wonder if not all this talk about, you know, masculinity and men's groups are kind of counterproductive, because, you know, we have to face, in any case, you know, chaos in a way, and contest, that's the word, with chaos, and create something new and be tested. And so, you know, all this talk about, you know, us in relationship to women and you know, postmodernity, and I find that kind of, you know, what's the word? Shit, now my English is losing me. It's not constructive, right? So because like we have to find solutions in any case to be active and to contend with chaos. You know what I'm getting at? So, you know, are you familiar with the life story of Buckminster Fuller?
Well, yes, enough. I've read Critical Path.
Right, that's a fantastic book. So you know the story basically that he left the university, and his wife was dying when he was like 34, and his kid was dying, and his whole world was like crumbling. And so he contemplated about killing himself. And then he decided, no, I will be my own guinea pig, and I will, you know, devote my life in service of the world. And then what was followed was like 50 years of creative endeavors and new inventions, and the geodesic dome, and this and this, and that's like fantastic. And so for me, that is kind of like the archetype of, you know, the phallic, you know, so there is chaos, the world is crumbling, you know, independently of what everybody says, you know, he created a personality in a way to deal with the world. And so he didn't have that kind of gaze, you know, which is so postmodern. You know, if you look at, I called this I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but you know this idea of a therapeutic gaze. You know, so you know, you have psychology coming in for 150 years, and now everybody has these tools, and everybody's looking at their own psyche in terms of, well, I might have this problem, or I might have this problem, and you know, it's like it's an endless circle of psychological problems you might have, or you might have, right? It's like a therapeutic gaze you put on yourself, and it's so feminine in a way, instead of just, you know, just okay, let's leave that all behind and just do something. And that is so my quarrel in a way with, you know, men's movements, or, you know, because it's like, of course people need sometimes therapy or philosophy, but at the end of the day, that's just like, okay, let's get out of the house and confront chaos, and maybe we die, but at least we have lived, right? And so what do you know what I'm talking about?
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. So, like, one, Buckminster Fuller is a fantastic autobiographical case study for a phallic figure. And even the way you're framing his development is interesting, right? Because he has to confront this absolute negativity before he can start his quote unquote positive mapping project. For me, how I wanted to end the presentation was by saying, you know, and for me, when I was including myself as a figure in this, my own psychic developmental process, I sort of come to the position of positive mapping in the void. Like, okay, I'm in negativity, but I'm gonna nonetheless, I'm going to continue on my phallic drive, and I'm going to try and create the best world I can. And I'm going to align with the brothers. Like that's even what I was saying is what I think is happening in the Red Pill, the Manosphere movement. The best aspects of them, I think, are coming to the conclusion that they need to form positive brotherhoods, or as individuals, like, you know, however it's done, but to network basically with other men who have gone through that same existential despair, and to come out on the other side with, as a phallic drive, with your word and your structure as a positive ontological force.
Right.
So the only reason I feel like, well, one, I wanted to give a presentation today on the historical context of masculinity and how, at least how I see it, and how we wrote about it in the book. I think that there is value in understanding large-scale philosophical movements, because large-scale philosophical movements do have an effect on how society is organized and like the other people who you will be interacting with on your phallic mission, on your phallic drive. So it's good to be aware, at least, of, you know, the kind of larger social forces within which you're situating your drive. But I think that another aspect of it is that I do think that there is some positive value in critique and deconstruction of over-masculinization, because there is a way in which men can become too identified with their particular logos fantasy, and then conversation with them becomes impossible, and they can't think of anything new, really, because they're just trapped in their own circle of words. So there is a threat to over-masculinization, and I think that there are benefits, at least for me, I've noticed positive benefits in, you know, sort of exploring the androgynous zone. But I think that that's for every individual to decide for themselves. But overall, I want to just affirm your basic insight, which is this over-psychologization of oneself, because that is just an endless loop of sort of being sort of overly self-obsessed and narcissistic, as opposed to just sort of understanding yourself well enough to use your psychic apparatus in a positive function,
right,
and to get away from yourself in some sense.
Right, and this is what I was asking. You know, how, you know, it's like, because I imagine, and sometimes I have the feeling that, you know, in those groups, you know, this internal loop of, you know, let's problemize masculinity is like it's creating an own attractive field. You know, prohibiting people get out of the system and actually doing something. And so, do you see that problem? Could you give a concrete example of a community that you see doing that, so I can sort of relate it to something? Well, I mean, like take you know, on the spectrum, you know, the extremists, say, for example, like incels. Yeah, like who define themselves in opposition to females. Oh, that's a trap. You know, but, you know, it's like a spectrum, you know, so where, and, you know, having this gaze and this internal loop where they are not like, through the group dynamics, not being able to, you know, actually confront the chaos. And so that's what I was asking. Yeah, look, if you're falling into a subculture, whose identity depends on some opposite evil figure. And I do think that there is a risk of people in our own community making the woke this type of evil figure. But like in masculine subcultures where, you know, women are hypergamous, women are X, Y, and Z. You know, whatever it is the theory is about the horribleness of women's nature or something, you know, and then you get fixed in your identity on this opposite external enemy. This is only throwing yourself into your own victimhood loop. Right. So you're becoming what you hate, which is exactly what I felt like the sort of the extreme aspects of the SJWs did with postmodern philosophy. They became what they hated. Right. And they made a fool of themselves. And I think men can do the same thing. Yeah. Men, and I think it's not helpful in the end. Like it's you're building a prison for yourself because you don't want to confront the void, and you're not capable of imagining your own potential outside of, you know, this horizon of symbolism.
Yeah. Right. Can I make a couple comments here on like perhaps a defense of men's groups? I mean, the right kind of men's groups, because
but I would defend that too.
It's quite obvious what the bad kind of men's groups are. there's this, sort of posturing and this kind of muscly kind of thing on one hand, or there's the hate, there's misogyny or there's, complaining about women. But in a positive men's group, there's no complaining about women. I mean, that doesn't happen in my experience, or that shouldn't happen. And that's probably a sign that when people start to complain about women, that's a sign of a weak men's group, I would say. And what I find that is interesting about a men's groups is you find another mode or way of being, which we've lost in the present culture. It might exist, in some places, like, a bunch of people sitting around the fire, would kind of quietly, and then they would speak their truth. And it sounds kind of corny and new age and stuff like that. But there's one guy, I remember him saying that, the men's group was so valuable to him that, that he would sort of die for these men.
I totally support men.
And hold on, that he would die for these men. Right. That was the first thing. And when do we feel like that in the postmodern culture? When do we have that intensity of experience?
Well, that's actually in the military, obviously. Mm-hmm.
In the military, definitely. Yeah. But if you're not in the military and you're somebody like me who grew up with women and was very progressive and very feminized and was looking around, it's like something's not working here. Like,
yeah. Yeah, sorry, Cadell. I know you want to say something, but let me just put one. Let me put some fire into the discussion. So, like, why, as a man, would you go into a men's group in the first place? Why would you do that?
Sure. So I mean, I think that there's an interesting conversation here. Like, let's try to do it as nuanced as possible. So let me try and include myself again into this whole process, because in some sense I feel like it's cheating if you don't deeply include yourself in these conversations, because what are we talking about? Like, we're talking about our own way in which we relate to sexual energy and gender identity and stuff like this. For me, I have joined a men's circle not to sort of endlessly psychologize myself or not to demonize women, but to sort of get a higher order understanding of my developmental and intergenerational identity. So that's the function of the men's group for me. It's useful for me to hear another man. So I'm 34. It's useful for me to hear a man who's 20, and it's useful for me to hear a man who's 45 talk to me about their particular struggles, because it helps to put the context of my struggle into a developmental intergenerational lens. Whereas if I'm just by myself with my own struggles, then I feel kind of like an isolated, atomized neoliberal subject. There is a way in which we are deeply tribal, like in terms of Bard's thesis of tribal mapping. I definitely agree with him that it's revolutionary today to be deeply tribal. And by tribal, I mean, I'm going to a men's circle tonight. There's no money involved. This isn't about career advancement. This isn't about bitching at women. This isn't about, woe is me. This is about building tribe. When I think about my motion as a subject, I go to the store and I go and buy, my lunch. Or I go out and I walk around and I see a beautiful woman and I want to talk to her. I'm being pulled by a primal impulse. So the primal impulse, I need to eat, or the primal impulse, I want to be close, sexually close. Why do I go to the men's circle? I analyze my own psyche while I'm going, because it's easier to stay in bed and just sleep than to take myself up to get up after a long day work. I'm exhausted, and to go and do this seemingly functionless activity.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why, when I analyze my psyche, is because I do want tribe.
And also because right now we're in a way we're doing that right now. This is a mini men's group. It just arises spontaneously. 3 men having a trialogue.
Totally.
And if there was a hot nubile woman in the room, it would something would be different. Maybe it would be better in some ways, or even if there was an older woman in the room. I don't want to be vulgar here, but there would be a different dynamic, and this dynamic is interesting. It's not quite the same, and I think it's a primordial dynamic, and it's an important dynamic, and some people are lacking that in their life, and that's the only reason why there's men's groups. I mean, they don't have to exist if that wasn't there. These are
two different things.
But I think that in every community now there should be men's groups always, because there's a bunch of adolescents running around the streets, in Paris with absolutely no direction whatsoever, and so they need men's groups. I mean, they don't need women psychologists. In my opinion, that might sound sexist or something, but it's not.
No, I get it. I mean, I want to maybe affirm what you're saying, Andrew.
They don't need social workers. They need, deep, sorry, I'm interrupting, but deep relationships with other men.
Right. I agree with you. I want to affirm what you're saying and affirm what Tom's saying, like with a maybe interesting example. So when I think more deeply about my development as a child and a teenager, man, all my development was tribal. Like when I was a teenager, me and my guy friends, we would be together all the time. What would we be doing? We'd be playing hockey, we'd be playing basketball, we'd be playing baseball, we'd be playing football. We were out as a group doing some active physical work together.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely one of the best times of my life when I was with those guys. There's something so deeply sad to me when I transitioned from this phase to my young 20s, and I saw that what the guys were doing increasingly was going to the bar and getting drunk and watching sports on TV instead of playing sports. So there was a way in which I lost a brotherhood there, which I never really filled. And like, I'm only trying to fill it now with what we're calling men's groups. But to affirm what Tom's saying, I think it is a sign of a symptom. Now, I think it's still a good thing, but I do think it's a sign of a symptom when you have to name it men's group. Because in some sense you're because when me and my guy friends as teenagers went out to play basketball or baseball, we didn't call it a men's group. We just said, like, we all want to play baseball. and we're going to get together, and what's going to happen there? We're going to be guys. We're going to shove each other. We're going to play around. We're going to, we develop friendships, whatever. So I think one thing that would be healthy would be like reasons to come together and have strong, positive brotherhoods for like some really deep, meaningful function. But it might not have to call itself a men's group, if that makes sense. But at the same time,
it does. You know why it does? Can I say? Sure. I just want to say why it needs to call itself a men's group. Is because when my grandfather, was younger, or when I used to hang out with my grandfather at our cottage in Canada, all the men would get together and hang out, and in the morning they would go swimming in the back, and the women would go swimming in the front, and the women would be like unburdened from the attention of the men for a while, and they would be in sort of joyful kind of communion with each other, the women, and the men would be doing the men thing, in another kind of communion, and the society today, the postmodern society, would like to erase all that, which means because of ideology, and it's ideology that's erasing all that. So you need other kind of ideology to bring to you need to fight the ideology by naming it something, so that you can get that primordial thing back. That's how I see it. Sorry, Tom, go ahead and.
No, I would like just to add something to both of you, because I think that's, super interesting. Like when I don't know how much you are, familiar with, spiral dynamics or these whole developmental models. And so you have like this postmodern stage, and then you have like integral, and then you have what is it called, turquoise or whatever. And so the interesting thing is that green and turquoise kind of looks the same, because they're both communal, but and lots of spiritual groups have this problem that they try to shortcut the way from green to turquoise without being having embodied that integral phase. And if you look at those models, it's like, okay, green and turquoise are more communal, but integral and modern are more like individual agency driven, right? And so what those models, what those groups lack is a reaffirmation of the whole individuation process, because you have to be communal, and then you have to oscillate to the more individual to be able to get with individuals together on a more higher level, so to speak, and to create new tribes. And so, it's like, I think what we are doing is not a men's group here. I don't think so. Because
no, I don't think so either.
So because I think what we're doing is there are three individuals like on their own trajectory having some sense of purpose, and that brings them together. Maybe we can create a parallax community out of that, but it is in a deep knowledge that we are within this individuation process, we are individuals, and because of that we can come together maybe as a new form of tribe, but it's not a men's group, That's true. It's not some postmodern reactionary, I have to find myself, and I have to deal with my masculinity in some way. No, I don't have to deal with my masculinity, and I would presume that Cadell and Andrew, that you don't have to deal with your masculinity. No, you act it out, and that's a completely different thing. And then we can come together and we can create something new. But I don't want to deal with my masculinity. No, I want to deal with the world. I want to deal with both of you. And that's a completely different paradigm.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, I think that there's a way in which the whole manosphere and red pill thing is perhaps a necessary reaction and a symptom of our age. But I think that as this whole motion, all these social formations mature, they're going to start to look like a lot what you're saying, Tom, which are organizations they are going to be led by men. Like the demographics, like the postmodern people will look at the demographics and they'll say like the men are at the top or something, or like the men created this. But they won't necessarily be overly identified as a man. And that's like the crucial I make this point in Sex, Masculinity, and God, which is if a subject is over-identified as a man, or if the subject is over-identified as a woman, I feel like that's a symptom. It's more of a sickness than a positive thing. Like, but in that sense, I see feminism as also this weird symptom, because women are struggling. What do I do with my female body, and how do I come to terms with the fact that I'm going to give birth, and what does that mean?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, okay. We're not a men's group, but we are a group, and we happen to be men, and that's not insignificant in terms of how we're communicating with each other and what's actually going on.
That's also true.
Uh-huh.
But I think the crucial point is just that yes, we're three guys, and yes, that affects how we're interacting with each other. But the main focus and the main drive is not necessarily to reaffirm our masculine identity. It's more to I think, like with Parallax, you're saying it's to shift the position of the observer and to see the world in a different way and to interact with the world in a different way. And like what Tom's saying is maybe in a more integral way.
Right. Well, I think the problem with the men's groups is that they have a cliche and unsophisticated version of what it means to be a man, whereas being a man, masculinity and femininity, these are not anything that can be defined. They're deep, kind of. They're so deep, and you discover more about them all the time. It's not like this is a man, he has a beard, or he has big, sorry, nothing against your beard. I mean, there's a man, he's got a beard and muscles, and he is, no, that's not what a man is, right? You can't define it. So I think that's one of the problems with men's group, because they have this super hardcore agenda, and that gets irritating. But I'm very interested in the male principle and the female principle. In fact, I don't think there's anything more interesting than that. Actually.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't imagine Picasso being part of a men's group, You can't really. But what you can imagine...
But you also can't imagine Picasso ever existing without a bunch of really strong male painters around.
No, but exactly. Yeah. But that's what I want to say, like the Paris years, where he was like engulfed with all these other individuals and creating like a whole, substructures, a field of creative endeavor. But these were like, all very, mature. I don't want to say mature, but, individualistic people.
Well, I think it's a great example, and I do think it's a good example to sort of self-reflectively analyze at least my experience of what's going on in the intellectual deep web, because, ever since I joined the intellectual deep web, I found it to be incredibly motivating and creatively inspiring. So it has stimulated and motivated and informed my work. And I do think that we do need those communities and tribes to sort of find our I guess, you could call them deeper brotherhoods, but, you could just as well call them, creative communities.
Yeah. I mean, there's women involved.
And there's women involved as well. So.
Yeah. And there should be probably more. I mean, in some sense.
Definitely.
I'm all for more women getting involved in these kind of things, but
I mean, I think ultimately, once you move through all this gender stuff fully, where at least where my mind comes is basically creative community. And how can we however people identify and however people relate to try our best to maximize the potential of every individual who is searching for actualization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I like the example of Picasso. That kind of makes me think, because, Picasso was kind of a dirty old man, and he painted all these, I saw his erotic exhibition at one point, and it was fantastic. I mean, it was so it kind of free in its approach, and that would be a very, very, very good model. But I wonder how many men are really that free in the internet age, to be that creative and open and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, at the same time,
I don't see people being that individualistic and creating art. I feel people are creating communities now. I feel we're moving into a stage of communitarianism or something.
Well,
I'm not sure. I have to think through that.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I'm always skeptical of idealizing the past, because yes, there are figures like Picasso and Salvador Dali and, X, Y, and Z. But I mean, most people were living quite a humble existence and working quite low-level jobs and just trying to make ends meet. And I think that the number of people who have a larger existential space to create beyond their base level existential condition is much higher than it's ever been in the past. And like, for example, just take me, for example. I mean, you can start a YouTube channel, you can put out anything you like, you can start your own blog, you can, the tools we have to create are more powerful than they've ever been before. And look at what we're doing right now. So, I mean, I think the capacity to use the new technology that exists and will continue to emerge in the next few decades is sort of something we should be constantly interacting with and experimenting with to create new mediums of creative expression as well. Because like McLuhan, right? Medium is the message.
Yeah.
If you control the medium, then that's more important than the particular message. Like I'm on the Parallax platform right now.
Well, in the McLuhan world, we're all kind of becoming artists in some sense. Like you have to be an artist, like your whole, because you have to work with the total environment, because the media is an environment, and so what we would be doing now would be cold media, right? There's just three guys, and it's very lo-fi information, and there's any kind of conversation. There's no script, right? It's not scripted. In any kind of way, but it's a kind of media, and it's a kind of improvisation, and it's a kind of communal art, which is occurring in some spontaneous way. Yeah. So yeah, I'm interested in that, and I do share Tom's like ambivalence about men's groups as being actually very female sometimes, because I think that I noticed that also when I lived in a monastery, the men become very female. They become very nurturing and caring for each other. They need to develop their female side. So monks become very female. And also I noticed the nuns became very male because they had to be much more, directive and than usual. So the men's groups often they could create more feminine men in a weird kind of way. Rather than individualistic type of, Picasso's or. Mm-hmm.
For me, androgyny is a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
And a very mysterious phenomenon, because we can't underestimate the degree to which our gender identity is a consequence of genital maturation. So when you're pre and post genital maturation,
mm-hmm.
You're kind of released from a certain constraint, which has been really quite fundamental for identity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's incredibly powerful. I mean, why are concepts like the phallus so important in psychoanalysis is because if you just think about it from an evolutionary perspective, in your erection, you're holding an unbelievable power. It's the entire genetic history of your lineage manifesting itself in the present moment. And it's a power which can create life. So it's overwhelming to think about. And it totally makes sense that phenomenon is coupled with an excitation which drives the mind mad.
Yeah.
So it's fun to think about in that way also.
Yeah. It's interesting how men sort of get hard-ons for things, right?
Yeah.
They get like so stupid and excited about stuff.
Exactly.
And after you're like, what was I doing? And like, this like deflation, right? This incredible energy, and then suddenly, it's like just I suck. And I don't know. I find that's like part of the masculine thing, which I don't know if women always get that particularly, but
totally.
What are you gonna say? You gonna say something, Tom?
Oh, there's a question in the chat.
We have a question. What is it? Do you think patriarchy can be defined? Yeah. That's what I was talking to Paul about. Our friend Paul from Manifesto.
Yeah. I'd be interested. Did Paul have a response to that?
Well, I had a bit of a discussion with him, and Paul's view of patriarchy was he was saying, okay, the digital world is patriarchal. And I say, no, the digital world is matriarchal. We had this kind of back and forth. He said, well, they're all guys. Yeah, I say, well, yeah, they're all boys. They're all boyish, sort of. I'm making generalizations here, but I'm talking about the Silicon Valley Facebook. He described that as a patriarchy, and I thought that was wrong. I thought that's not a patriarchy. I mean, if he was trying to make the term patriarchy a noble term rather than an insult, which is the pop culture thing today, but perhaps there's a noble version of patriarchy which could be discovered.
Well, there's an anthropological definition of patriarchy, which is a system of society where lineage is tracked through the male line. Mm-hmm. So, like that's the anthropological definition, whereas it is you literally are structuring the society by the quote unquote name of the father.
Yeah,
that's the standard definition, isn't it?
That's the anthropological definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think you see people trying to mess around with that. I mean, of course, feminist critique of the patriarchy, like there's a few different angles you can take it. So, like, the feminist view of the patriarchy is basically in a mode of power distribution, that there's an asymmetry in power, and that power is being concentrated in the public sphere through men, and that this is barring access for female bodies. Then you could have the philosophical definition of the patriarchy, which I think was defined by Derrida, where he said it's phallogocentric. So that would be that it's basically the phallus and the logos, and that we organize our society through phallic-driven speech.
Yeah.
And so he was viewing that from a deconstructive mode, where I'm saying we should see that as a positive ontological force, which has to constantly be renewed for the present moment.
Yeah. And I also, when I was talking with Paul, I said, we also have to define what a matriarchy is. And if we're going to have a patriarchy, we also have to have a matriarchy. You can't have one term without the other. And a matriarchy you have to have a noble conception of what a matriarchy is, even though on a societal level, there weren't that many matriarchies, in an anthropological level, they didn't really exist. But on the other hand, there were still powerful females behind the scenes, which might not be in the public sphere, but certainly there are powerful females always in the private sphere.
Well, there's another comment by Adrian which I'd like to respond to, which he says, because if you say so this is, I think, in response to what you said, Andrew, as he said, because if you say masculinity can't be defined, then patriarchy can't either, I think. And so I can give him something here from psychoanalysis, because I always say Freud famously said that masculinity and femininity were concepts that were poorly defined. However, in psychoanalysis, the libido is linked to the masculine principle. And if you go deep into what he means by that, what he basically means is it's basically an active principle. It's this active pointing outwards. It's kind of like how Tom was describing Buckminster Fuller, just this active force of logos. And I think that would be that's how I presented it in the presentation as well, that masculinity is sort of connected to logos, narrative, and sort of active narrativization. Whereas femininity is seen as more of a passive principle and a receptive principle, and constituted by sort of the formation of an image. So I think that those two are at least good starting points for me. I mean, if you go to ground zero of, take for example, the pickup artist community. Like in the pickup artist community, you see sort of ground zero of masculinity and femininity kind of working itself out. And what happens there is you have men being trained to use words properly and to act out in the world. And you have women who are being targeted for their image, and they're passive receivers of the word. So I think that acts itself out in various ways, but I mean, that's sort of my thinking on it.
I mean, Buckminster Fuller and Picasso, they're both outliers. If you have seen those videos from Buckminster Fuller, he was just manic. It's like how he talks and how fast, and how, all this stuff he was thinking. And I think Picasso did I don't know, what was it, 70,000 pieces of art in his life. That's a lot. But I was wondering if you, Cadell, if you have seen this video with Douglas Murray, where he said that, this obsessive dealing with transgender and, what gender in general is a sign of the end times. And it's like his argument basically was that, one of the signs a civilization, when a civilization is falling, historically is when people obsess about, you know, the differences between men and women, and transgender ideas come up, maybe in form of hermaphrodites or something like that. You see that in the Greek cultures, you know, so, you know, because, you know, all that was where previously were boundaries, you know, now it fragments, and, you know, he sees that as a sign of society falling apart, and so he sees that especially as a sign that the United States will fall apart in the next couple of 100 years. And so, what do you think about that?
Well, I know that people often say that about Rome as well, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, I don't want to come to any strong conclusions about the meaning of androgyny, because here's the weird thing. So let me put on my like deep philosophy hat for a moment. Just sort of why I'm like a little hesitant to give a too quick conclusion. In the biological world, the cycle of reproduction seems to be sort of a self-sustaining closed loop, which means that if the Earth and the solar system were to exist forever, then I would suspect that biological life would just continue to reproduce itself indefinitely. Does that make sense? So, of course, the solar system and the Earth aren't going to exist forever. They're going to, eventually they'll implode. And so biological life won't go on forever. It has a time limit from the constraint of the planet and the solar system itself. However, when it comes to human beings and reproduction, I see a kind of break or a discontinuous rupture as it relates to reproduction. So basically, because, and this is my hypothesis, is because we're linguistic and because we have culture and language, there's a trade-off when it comes to the energy and the time that we put into reproduction biologically and the energy and the time that we put into reproduction culturally. And as we become more abundant, as our culture becomes more abundant and technologically sophisticated, the developmental delay of reproduction keeps getting pushed back. And if you go into the evolutionary literature, this pushing back of reproduction has happened for millions of years now. If you look at the great apes reproduce much sooner and have less parental investment than the early hunter-gatherer tribes. And as agriculture emerges and industry emerges, reproduction gets pushed back further, and parental investment has to increase for the quality of the children instead of the quantity of the children. Now with feminist waves, you have entire epistemological structures which are trying to take women outside of reproduction. And you have an entire generation of humans who are choosing not to have children. In terms of the evolution of life, that is such a remarkable, strange phenomenon. It does not receive enough attention, because if that was to ever happen in a biological animal population where there was an abundance of resources, they would reproduce like mad. Right. There's a very famous studies about that. If you have biological animals in a highly abundant resource population, they undermine their own resource base because they reproduce too much. But humans are doing the opposite of that. When we have high abundance, we actively take ourselves out. So and then I try to connect this to theories about transhumanism, where they saying through technological modification, we are going to transcend the very process of biological evolution itself. So I just have questions here about the function of androgyny. Is androgyny actually the location where consciousness tries to push itself beyond biological evolution? These are just questions for me, but these are the types of things I try to think.
Well, it's interesting, like in the yogic tradition, I heard somebody say that, in the yogi has to become fully male and fully female, which means fully androgynous, right? In other words, the complete expression of humanity is not a polarized male and a polarized female, or it's both, like within one person. And I told that to somebody, Alexander. He was really pushing back on that, but I still think there's something to that, in the sense that a complete person, if such a person exists, is able to fully, embody the opposite of himself, and fully understand the opposite of himself, and that's completion by definition. Which doesn't mean that the process ends. It just means that this sort of male-female dance becomes a kind of unity, which I don't know, which is all completely creative at all times, which is like enlightenment or something like that, or like a full realization of creativity, because it's not biological creativity in the sense that you're chained to the reproductive cycle. It's a creativity which just continues and continues and continues without any of that.
Absolutely.
Well, birth or death, even. But that's that's getting on to the mystical level of things, which.
But in terms of, in relation to transhumanism, the question is if we actually want that, Cadell, really to be in that state of being androgynous. Is that something that we would want?
Well, that's the question of desire. Is that the authentic developmental pathway or not? And I think that the types of phenomena that Andrew's pointing towards with spiritual development can be seen in many different religious traditions, where people who are striving for enlightenment and choose to take themselves out of the marriage pattern with reproducing biologically, they do sort of tend towards forms of identity which are beyond either the man or the woman strictly. So I think that's even like the shamanistic figure, or the type of shaman or the androgynous type that Bard talks about is a kind of pushing of identity beyond tethering to biological reproduction. So I think I'm just mostly trying to provoke, and just like I'm interested in it. I like thinking about it. But Mads has an interesting question, which maybe we could unmute him if he wants to ask it.
Is he here, Mads, or is he in the YouTube?
He's in the Zoom.
He's here. Yeah. Mads, do you want to unmute yourself, or would you prefer that I read the question aloud? Okay, so I'm not hearing from him. So I'll just read it. Oh wait. Are you there?
He says he's not appropriately dressed.
Okay. Can you read it though? Do you want to read your question, Mads?
He's unmuted, so.
Yeah, he's unmuted, so that's why I was asking. Okay, but anyway, we don't hear him. Okay, I'll read it. I sometimes feel that the masculine demand for meaning and purpose comes across as a symptom. For example, to me, it seems like a person like Jordan Peterson is covering up his anxiety by demanding meaning in an almost hysterical way. What are your thoughts on the idea of being on purpose? And could another way of being come through positive nihilism, the masculine accepting what it is and going beyond purpose, holding the space gap? Sorry, I'm not appropriately dressed.
Yeah.
Well, that was because he wasn't coming on with the camera. But anyway, that wasn't part of the question.
I think Mads missed my presentation itself, but Mads, I concluded the presentation by saying basically that for me, the job of the masculine identity is to sort of confront the void and engage in a positive mapping project, inclusive of negativity. But I want to respond precisely to your question on the masculine demand of meaning and purpose coming across as a symptom, because I think that was related to the discussion Andrew and Tom and I were having about men's groups and identification with men's groups. So in my experience, if you're talking too much about meaning and purpose, it's a problem. I think if you're actually living a meaningful and purposeful life, you don't need to talk about it. You just are doing it. Like, for example, like my academic drive and my intellectual drive has been so authentic that I've never had to say to myself, I'm living a purposeful life, or I have meaning, or I'm like, or even like, it's kind of like if you start talking about meaning and purpose, it's a sign that you're symptomatic already. So it's kind of like once it becomes, it's kind of like what Tom, you were saying about the over-psychologization of self. It's kind of like if you're paying too much attention to it, if you're becoming too self-referential about it, then you've kind of lost it. That's why you're talking about it.
Yeah. What about Peterson, though? You mentioned Jordan Peterson, and he's always an interesting guy to think about because obviously he's responding to nihilism, right?
Yeah.
Mass nihilism.
Well, I think Jordan Peterson is talking about meaning and purpose because he's speaking to a generation of men and women who don't feel like they have it. So I feel like in some sense he is trying to fill the gap and is trying to, sort of remind people that you can't just worry about food and water and shelter and sex. You also have to pay attention to the meaning of your life. And there is and at the same time, I do feel like there's something about Jordan Peterson's identity, which is overly identified with the masculine and overly identified with sort of certain aspects of the search for meaning and purpose. But I also don't really want to overly criticize him because it's kind of like a meme to criticize him now. Whereas I feel like the amount of good that he's done in the world and the number of men, including myself, that he has helped is overwhelming. So I feel like he is a positive ontological force in the world overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, I think.
There's a YouTube question. Should I read it?
Please.
Okay. I read that up to 10% of young people identify as non-binary today and rising, which I think is another symptom for the struggles of being masculine or feminine. What do you think?
It is rising. Non-binary identification is rising. So in the end of my presentation, I said that I felt like I proposed a quadratic categorization scheme. So to me, the quadratic categorization scheme overcomes problems of multiplicity. So like just saying I'm non-binary is kind of a negative placeholder against being a man or a woman. But for me, I think it could be interesting to explore, like the fact that at least the people I've encountered is you can be a masculine man, you can be a feminine man, you can be a masculine woman, or you can be a feminine woman. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're, just a negation against traditional masculinity or femininity. It could be that there's a gap between your symbolic representation and your biological body. And also in regards to the rise of androgynous identification, I don't think we should underestimate the anxiety of neoliberal sexuality, because when sexuality is free of all regulation, when sexuality is under this complete neoliberal model, there's a way in which sexuality can start to feel like a prison, and you can start to feel like you are in a zero-sum competition with the other sex, and also that you can come to realize in your consciousness just how unfair free sexuality is. Because, look, attraction is not it's not there's
no such thing, is there?
It's not a horizontal field. It's not a horizontal field. It's radically unequal. Like, there are some people on this planet who get all the sexual attention, and there are some people on this planet that get no sexual attention. And that's vicious. And so there's something about that viciousness which I think leads people to non-binary identification, because they just want to escape the symptom of that.
That's a great point. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, if sexuality is always an economic trade-off of some kind, like you say, a zero-sum game, then and you're always playing this game, then there's always winners and there's a lot of losers.
Yeah,
but that's not a way to run a world or or a society.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah, but I mean, I think that's why we're talking about like religion, theology, collective society organization, and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if there's any. We have 5 minutes left in our scheduled time,
sure.
And we've been pretty good at keeping it kind of like. I feel like this conversation could go on forever, practically, but we've been pretty good at keeping our time. Is there anybody left who has a final?
There's someone named Moran in the Zoom who asked a question.
Someone named Moran. Okay.
Oh, it's to me privately. Maybe he did that by mistake.
That's Tom. He's talking. He had to leave for a second to get some food. Okay. Well, then there's no more. If there's no more questions, the last question might be like, what does sexuality look like in the tribe? We've been talking about tribalism, and we talk about this a lot, and about how we have to discover community and all this sort of thing. So how does sexuality? What does it look like in a tribe?
You know what? I mean, it's such a big question. It's hard for me to summarize or imagine it, but and I think that there's a little bit of romantic idealization about sexuality in the tribe with contemporary sort of books like Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan, where he's arguing that when we were in the tribe, we were just polymorphous, sort of like open relationships. Everyone was kind of having sex with everyone else in a very non-neurotic way. Mm-hmm. But of course, that would be a hypothesis that Freud would definitely disagree with, because in Totem and Taboo, Freud argued that tribes regulated sexuality through identification with a totem. So if you were part of the shared totem culturally, then you couldn't have sex within that totem tribe. Mm-hmm. So you had to have sex sort of as a boundary negotiation with another tribe. But sex within the tribe was kind of regulated and reduced, basically because of problems of violence, mm-hmm. Because sexuality is so inherently unequal.
Yeah. That's what I really wanted to talk about that, and I totally forgot, because we've been talking about what comes first, like sexuality or violence or sexuality.
I think they're mutually implicated.
Yeah, and I was thinking about I was thinking about Genesis, and I was thinking about the story of sexual jealousy as the beginning of the fall, which then leads to the story of Cain and Abel, which then leads to violence. So I wonder if sexual jealousy is really the beginning of human violence, and so that's just a thought.
Yeah. I think I know Moran's left his comment in the chat. And there's another guy, Diego, who I think is trying to talk.
Diego, do you want to say something before we go?
I wanted to say hello.
Hey, Diego.
I kept hearing that there were only 3, and I wanted to say that there's more here.
Yeah, we've got quite a few panelists now.
Yeah, okay. There's 8 people as panelists, and there's a bunch of people watching on YouTube. But thank you for piping in. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt it would be nice to acknowledge other people in this space.
Sure. And yeah, this kind of turned into a bit of a trialogue, and people were commenting in this space, but I wasn't always sure what was a question and what
it becomes like a panel, and we are passively here.
Mm-hmm.
So,
you're free to ask a question, Diego, if you have one.
Well, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say hello, and I know we're coming to the end now. But you must have all read Jitterbug Perfume. That just came to mind when you were speaking earlier about patriarchy and matriarchy, because that touched on that.
That's Tom Robbins or something? Is that Tom Robbins? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was such a long time ago, but it's a great novel. And it presupposes that there was a time before when there was a matriarchy, and as a reaction to that emerged this patriarchy. It's this idea of cycles. And it's like this tug of war. And I think they try to reconcile that, not these two characters in the book, but it seems that in the natural order of things, if we find ourselves, and if it's safe for the other to be, then perhaps we can, rather than this constantly sort of one consuming the other, or one existing at the cost of the other, there seems to be this war, no? I mean, with feminism and we've sort of, the pendulum seems to swing. So
if between a hyper masculine and a hyper feminine society, in a sense.
Yeah, or a matriarchal and patriarchal, you know, between feminine and masculine. And how can both exist?
All right, how can both exist?
Well, I don't know if you were here for my presentation, but I sort of emphasized that in my analysis, at least, of the current gender relations, it's kind of people are interacting with each other sexually as if it's a zero-sum competition where it's a win-lose situation. So it's in this sort of oppositional battle. But I think that we have to look for the possibilities of positive sum relationships between men and women. And I guess my thought for how we would start that, or how we could work towards that, and in some sense it's already, it's all, maybe wording's the problem, but that a way to go about finding positive sum relationships between men and women is to start with a mapping projects of the bodies that we have to work with, and a recognition of sort of sexual difference. And then if we can be deeply aware and deeply conscious of our differences in embodied consciousness, then there's a possibility to think what would be positive sum relations in this current environment. Okay, let's leave it at that.
So thank you very much, Cadell, for a wonderful conversation, I thought. And we look forward to hearing back from you next month, where you're going to talk about God and your final triad of taboo, impossible subjects. So that will be excellent, I'm sure. I can't wait to talk to you about God and to finish this trialogue. And we'll also see you, I think it's Friday night, with Raven and Alexander Bard. We have a 4-person panel. The 4 of us are going to talk on the Sweeney versus Bard podcast. And then we're going to invite people for Q&A in the last part of it. So that's going to be awesome. And if you love this and you feel like supporting us on Patreon or any kind of support, signing up for our YouTube, or we also have a podcast now, we're also on the podcast network, and we have all kinds of projects and plans for Parallax. And we're really, really happy for Cadell, one of the brightest, voices out there, in my opinion, to be coming here and speaking to us. So thanks so much, everybody, and good night.